In a previous video, I explored Final Fantasy XV's overwhelming amount of Christian influences. Since then, two things have happened. First, Final Fantasy XV has received no less than 7 major narrative expansions. Second, it has become abundantly clear that Final Fantasy XV was influenced not just by Christianity, but a specifically Catholic flavor of Christianity. In order to properly recognize Final Fantasy XV's Catholic influence, it is important to understand the concept of a sacramental imagination. To the sacramental imagination, every aspect of material reality has the potential to reflect the truth, goodness, and beauty of God. While God himself is invisible and incomprehensible, his presence is expressed through tangible material signs called sacraments. The sacramental imagination, in other words, recognizes our dependence on our senses and develops sensible realities into symbols to mediate between the material and the immaterial. In practice, the sacramental imagination is simultaneously grounded in the embodiment of its subject and lifted towards the absolute heights of human experience. The everyday experience of the body remains critical, even as that same experience points to a reality beyond itself. As a result, the sacramental imagination tends to be simultaneously sensual and sacred. Bearing all that in mind, what does any of it have to do with FF15? Quite a lot, actually. To begin with, Final Fantasy XV shares Catholicism's focus on the body and the senses. I'm not aware of any other game which is as endlessly fascinated with the physical trappings of everyday life as FF15 is. Consider the game's almost obsessive focus on food and sleep, some of the most basic of all human needs. Even on a mechanical level, the core gameplay loop is designed to end with a lovingly rendered meal and a good night's sleep. Of course, Final Fantasy XV's ambitions extend far beyond simply replicating the body's needs. Food and rest are intertwined with companionship. The presence of Prompto's photographs at camp renders that connection undeniable. By the end of the game, the physical elements serve the even higher end of grounding Noctis' sacrifice in something familiar. It's no accident that the party comes to terms with Noctis' sacrifice in the context of a final communal meal, or that one of Prompto's photographs serves as the tactile link between Noctis' life and afterlife. Final Fantasy XV's second approach to the body might seem to contradict its concern for the body's physical and social well-being. FF15 consistently focuses on bodies that are suffering from weakness, pain, and brokenness. In the sacramental imagination, physical evil speaks not so much of its own presence as it does of the absence or even rejection of the good. The clear physical disabilities of the glaives who hail Noctis' return to insomnia are a particularly telling instance of this. The brokenness of the individual glaives, in a sense, reflects the whole world's desperate need for a savior. At the same time, Final Fantasy XV recognizes that there's often a cost to resisting evil. Even when done with the best intentions, pushing a body beyond its natural limits has consequences, from warping-induced motion sickness to blindness. Rather than suggesting the absence of the good, however, the willingness to pay such a cost reflects the even higher good of self-sacrifice. The image of the Citadel shown after the credits is particularly instructive here. In a neat parallel to the wound in the side of the risen Christ, the hole that remains in the Citadel's side actually serves to complement its newfound glory. Final Fantasy XV's third approach to the body can be seen in episode Prompto, which explicitly links the rejection of the good and the exploitation of the body. The nature of the Magitech soldiers is hinted at in the main game, but episode Prompto takes the implications to another level. In rejecting his own humanity, Verstyle unleashes horror upon the world, from his mass-produced army of cloned offspring to his sickening attempt to transcend his human body through demonic transmutation. This dynamic is not limited to episode Prompto. It is readily apparent in Ardyn's demonic transformation as well. Rejecting the inherent dignity of the human body, as far as Final Fantasy XV is concerned, inevitably creates monsters. One particularly chilling instance of this principle is Arden's treatment of the bodies of other people. The depth of Arden's inhumanity is demonstrated not so much through murder and mayhem as in his casual desecration of human corpses. It's hard not to be disgusted by the crude marionettes he strings up in the throne room or the pathetic shambling husk that had once been Ravis. Even in death, the game recognizes the dignity of the human body, and it suggests that Arden's rejection of that is what makes him so monstrous. Final Fantasy XV's artistic ties to the Sacramental Imagination may be less nuanced, but they're much easier to recognize. To begin with, let's consider 3 pieces of key art. The first is an illustration in Luna's cosmogony book portraying Gentiana, Umbra, and Prina. Note that while none of these messengers actually have wings, all 3 have wings in the illustration. This symbolic association is taken wholesale from Catholicism. Angels are portrayed as winged not because they are winged humans, but rather because wings are a visible sign of their nature as divine messengers. And this brings us to our second piece of key art, the game's logo. It is commonly known that this logo was not originally intended to represent Luna. Nevertheless, the aforementioned symbolism makes the adaptation surprisingly effective. The figure in the logo has a single wing, after all, which makes it a perfect symbol for a mediator between humanity and divinity. Our third artwork is the Genesis painting. Like the logo, this painting portrays Luna with a single wing. Beyond that, the painting itself closely imitates the visual stylings of Renaissance art. On a deeper level, the tiered structure, dichotomy between the divinized and the damned, and the spotlight on the chosen savior bear a particular resemblance to a tradition of artwork portraying the Last Judgment. Furthermore, the Catholic motifs extend to the game's sculptures, which take 3 primary forms. The first is the woman in mourning, whose cloak and veil immediately call to mind the Virgin Mary. The second is the angel. The third and most interesting category sits atop the various columns in the citadel. While we know little about the figures portrayed by these statues, the use of physical artifacts to distinguish between individuals is common in statues of saints. Consider, for instance, the statues sitting atop the colonnade of St. Peter's Basilica. And speaking of the colonnade of St. Peter's, it clearly inspired the colonnade of Altissia, which evokes a similar sense of invitation and inclusion. Distinctively Catholic architecture can be found in a number of other places as well, from the homage to the Basilica di San Marco in Altissia to the Gothic look of the citadel's facade. Even the citadel's interior draws upon Catholic influence, from its Baroque woodworking to its altar-like tables. At first, the references that Final Fantasy XV's costume design makes to priestly vestments might not seem all that unusual. RPGs, after all, have a long history of making the clergy of every organized religion dress like Catholic priests. What distinguishes FF15 from its brethren is who gets to wear said priestly vestments. Luna represents organized religion in Eos, but she isn't the one dressed like a priest. Rather, the vestments are bestowed on the Lucian nobility. In avoiding the obvious, Final Fantasy XV takes the focus off of surface-level associations in favor of a deeper and more interesting connection. After all, from a Catholic perspective, priestly vestments are not mere symbols of organized religion. Rather, they suggest continuity with an ancient tradition of sacrifice. In that light, it makes perfect sense for priestly vestments to be reserved for the king and his attendants. It's worth pointing out how effectively the use of the color black complements this interpretation. For one thing, when they're not celebrating Mass, priests tend to dress in plain black suits. Furthermore, the color black is traditionally associated with death, and Final Fantasy XV has it worn by those, like the Crown's Guard, Kingsglaive, and the King himself, who are expected to sacrifice themselves for others. On the other end of the spectrum, of course, is Arden, who seeks revenge against the gods. Is there any article of clothing more absurdly appropriate for such a figure than Arden's prominently displayed fedora? No exploration of Final Fantasy XV's Catholic influence would be complete without mentioning its music. This influence is most clearly seen, of course, in the game's language of choice. Many of the game's most memorable tracks, including Somnus, are sung in Latin. A Clash of Swords in particular manages to combine Latin with gospel music, and the first line of Apocalypsis Noctis roughly translates to, "Through you alone there will be worship." Furthermore, there's the Gregorian-style chant in the Song of the Stars theme, which sounds particularly liturgical in its a cappella incarnation. On a related note, did anyone else notice the cross in the photographs from the Piano Collections concert? Let's begin our exploration of Final Fantasy XV's relationship to the sacred by considering explicit references to the Catholic understanding of divinity. Some of these associations were in the game from the very beginning. The concept of patron saints, for instance, was applied to the Astrals, albeit in a slightly modified form, even in the base game. Many of them, however, were introduced in the game's expanded lore. According to the expanded Chapter 12, for instance, human beings were created in the image of the Astrals. In the new datalog entries, Rama's Judgment Bolt attack is specifically associated with divine judgment passed on sinners, and Angel Guard is recognized as a place sought out by those on pilgrimage. Even some seemingly meaningless details play their part. While Noctis' last name is usually translated as Light of the Sky, it may be more appropriate to render it as Heaven's Light. While Final Fantasy XV does apply certain aspects of divinity to the Astrals, however, it is important to remember that the game does not actually suggest that the Astrals created humanity. In fact, it is strongly implied that the Astrals are bound by a will that transcends their own. Ifrit's rage against humanity is portrayed not only as morally wrong, but also as an act of disobedience, and the other Astral's defense of humanity is conversely portrayed as the discharge of a duty. Leviathan has no love for humanity, but she still felt compelled to fight in their defense. In context, it is obvious that the Astrals were never intended to seek dominion. Their power was given for the purpose of serving the world of Eos. This connection between power and service is not restricted to the Astrals, however. The power granted to the King of Kings is greater still, but this power is conditioned on his willingness to act in service of the world. The Oracle's power, likewise, is intended to serve the world through the king. In Kingsglaive, the need to use power selflessly is made even more explicit during Nyx's attempted negotiation with the Lucii. When Nyx attempts to sway them by offering to help them preserve their power, they react with nothing but scorn. It is only when he offers his very life for the service of others that he is found worthy to fight on their behalf. Finally, Comrades includes a line that places the need to serve in an explicitly Catholic context. The Oracle King specifically refers to the burden of service placed on the player's glaive as a cross they must carry. The flip side of Final Fantasy XV's concern with service, of course, is a focus on the consequences of attempting to seize power for oneself. No character better embodies this particular dynamic than Rayvis. Rayvis is so traumatized by his mother's sacrifice that he chooses to blame the people she died for rather than the Empire that murdered her. In a sense, his anger at Regis reflects his rejection of the duty to which his bloodline is bound. Like the Empire he chooses to serve, Rayvis attempts to seize power for his own ends rather than to use his power in service of others, which eventually leads to severe chastisement by the Lucii. Unlike the Empire, however, Rayvis recognizes his mistake and seeks to correct it. He devotes his strength to protecting Luna, and eventually recognizes that, despite his misgivings, he cannot truly serve her without affirming her sacrificial resolve. While he is still overcome by grief when he finds Luna's body, he is eventually able to accept the inevitable. In the end, he returns to Gralea to face the Emperor and dies as a literal martyr, bearing witness to the King of Kings and fulfilling his own duty to the line of Lucis. Of course, Rayvis is not the only character to whom this applies. A similar dynamic is at play with the player's amnesiac glaive in Comrades. The playable glaives, it turns out, were traitors who were conscripted by Bahamut to atone for their crimes by dedicating their newly restored lives to the service of others. Aranea demonstrates elements of this as well. Like the glaives, she used her power for her own benefit, and, like them, She was called to defend the people of Eos from encroaching darkness for a decade. Even the unrepentant villains are offered the possibility of atonement and death. While neither Ifrit nor Arden can be spared, Noctis is asked to free each of them from their enthrallment to the darkness. FF15 might recognize the consequences of sin then, but it insists on holding out hope for even the worst of sinners. One of the most obvious fruits of the Catholic seed within Final Fantasy XV is its rather unusual take on sacrifice. Heroic sacrifices may be common in video games, but they also tend to be secular affairs. A character simply chooses to save others at the cost of their life. FF15, in contrast, never leaves it at that. In Eos, even practical sacrifices bear a sense of the sacred. First, let's consider the sacrifice of King Regis. There is nothing unusual about an older character giving his life to allow the heroes to escape. What stands out is the way Regis dies. Rather than falling in combat, he's executed ritualistically in what looks like a Baroque chapel, surrounded by religious iconography. While it's not stated explicitly, the visuals imply that Regis didn't just sacrifice himself, he is a sacrifice. Next, let's consider Nyx's sacrifice. As with Regis, there is nothing unusual about a hero giving his life to gain the power to save others. In Nyx's case, however, the nature of that power evokes a particularly ancient form of sacrifice. The Ring of the Lucii does not simply kill those who wear it. It consumes their flesh by fire. In death, Nyx becomes a burnt offering, the smoke of which is seen ascending to heaven at dawn as his life draws to a close. This burnt offering motif appears several times in the game as well. Canonically, Ignis' eyes are seared when he defends Noctis with the ring. In episode Ignis Extraverse, his whole body is set ablaze when he chooses to sacrifice his life. The destiny of the King of Kings is to become a burnt offering as well. Noctis' body and even the ring disintegrates once the power of Providence is unleashed. The ritual nature of Noctis' sacrifice is not limited to this motif, however. There's an overwhelming sense of intentionality in every action he takes once he ascends the throne. For his sacrifice to serve its purpose, it must take place in a specific preordained way at a specific preordained place, which, not coincidentally, looks like nothing so much as the high altar of a Baroque cathedral. There is, of course, another character who gives her life on an altar, Luna. In Luna's case, however, the game's Catholic influence takes a different form. When she passes away, Luna is assumed bodily and continues to act as an intercessor from beyond the grave, which creates a distinct association between her and the Virgin Mary, who Catholics believe was assumed bodily at the end of her life and continues to intercede on our behalf to this day. Finally, the way Final Fantasy XV envisions the salvation of the world is absolutely steeped in Catholicism. In my previous video, I discussed the many similarities between Noctis' sacrifice and Christ's Passion. Since then, Luminous Productions not only preserved all of the existing parallels, it actually managed to expand their scope to encompass the entirety of Holy Week. On one end, the Royal Edition alludes to Palm Sunday, when Noctis is recognized and revered as king by a throng of beaten and broken glaives. On the other end, the single fight with Ifrit is expanded into an extended descent into and harrowing of a now hellish insomnia, including fights with both the Underworld's guard dog and Ifrit himself, and concluding with Noctis freeing the souls of his enthralled ancestors. In addition to these parallels, one additional line of dialogue has fascinating religious implications. A single act of grace can save the human race. The actions of the king, the game implies, echo beyond his sacrifice to the good his people do in imitation of him, a theme which the broader game echoes in the efforts of his people to preserve the world in his absence. Last year, when I made my first video on this subject, I was wary of assuming that Final Fantasy XV's Christian symbolism was intentional. Given everything that has happened in the interim, however, I'm now convinced that the game's creators both knew what they were doing and drew upon a specifically Catholic tradition in doing so. Who knew that Final Fantasy, of all series, could produce a game with such theological depth?